Green Magic by Jack Vance. Originally published in the June 1963 issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, which republished it in their Best From anthology, 13th series, in 1964. It appeared in the March 1964 issue of a French magazine, and further anthologies include Special Wonder in 1970, a Dutch one in 1973, Strange Dreams in 1993, and Masterpieces of Terror and the Unknown in 1994. Appearances in collections of the author's stories include Green Magic in 1979, The Narrow Land in 1982, and Coup de Grace and Other Stories in 2001. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Green Magic. Howard Fair, looking over the relics of his great-uncle Gerald McIntyre, found a large ledger entitled Workbook and Journal, open at peril. Fair read the journal with interest, although his own work went far beyond ideas treated only gingerly by Gerald McIntyre. The existence of disciplines concentric to the elementary magics must now be admitted without further controversy, wrote McIntyre, guided by a set of anthologies from the white and black magics to be detailed in due course. I have delineated the basic extension of purple magic, as well as its corollary, dynamic nomism. Fair read on, remarking the careful charts, the projections and the expansions, the transpolations and transformations by which Gerald McIntyre had conceived his systemology. So swiftly had the technical arts advanced that McIntyre's expositions, highly controversial 60 years before, now seemed pedantic and overly rigorous. Whereas benign creatures, angels, white sprites, marihues, sandistins, are typical of the white cycle, whereas demons, magners, trolls, and warlocks are evinced by black magic, so do the purple and green cycles sponsor their own particulars, but these are neither good nor evil, bearing, rather, the same relation to the black and white provinces that these latter do to our own basic realm. Fair reread the passage. The green cycle? Had Gerald McIntyre wandered into regions overlooked by modern workers? He reviewed the journal in light of this suspicion and discovered additional hints and references. Especially provocative was a bit of scribbled marginalia. More concerning my latest researches I may not state, having been promised an infinite reward for this forbearance. The passage was dated a day before Gerald McIntyre's death, which had occurred on March 21st, 1898, the first day of spring. McIntyre had enjoyed very little of his infinite reward, whatever had been its nature. Fair returned to a consideration of the journal, which in a sentence or two had opened a chink on an entire new panorama. McIntyre provided no further illumination, and Fair set out to make a fuller investigation. His first steps were routine. He performed 2 divinations, searched the standard indexes, concordances, handbooks, and formularies, evoked a demon whom he had previously found knowledgeable, all without success. He found no direct reference to cycles beyond the purple. The demon refused even to speculate. Fair was by no means discouraged. If anything, the intensity of his interest increased. He reread the journal with particular care to the justification for purple magic, reasoning that McIntyre, groping for a lore beyond the purple, might well have used the methods which had yielded results before. Applying stains and ultraviolet light to the pages, Fair made legible a number of notes McIntyre had jotted down, then erased. Fair was immensely stimulated. The notes assured him that he was on the right track, and further indicated a number of blind alleys which Fair profited by avoiding. He applied himself so successfully that before the week was out he had evoked a sprite of the green cycle. It appeared in the semblance of a man with green glass eyes and a thatch of young eucalyptus leaves in the place of hair. It greeted Fair with cool courtesy, would not seat itself, and ignored Fair's proffer of coffee. After wandering around the apartment, inspecting Fair's books and curios with an air of negligent amusement, it agreed to respond to Fair's questions. Fair asked permission to use his tape recorder, which the sprite allowed, and Fair set the apparatus in motion. When subsequently he replayed the interview, no sound could be heard. "What realms of magic lie beyond the green?" asked Fair. "I can't give you an exact answer," replied the sprite, "because I don't know. There are at least 2 more corresponding to the colors we call rawn and palo, and very likely others." Fair arranged the microphone where it would more directly intercept the voice of the sprite. "What," he asked, "is the green cycle like? What is its physical semblance?" The sprite paused to consider. Glistening mother-of-pearl films wandered across its face, reflecting the tinge of its thoughts. "I'm rather severely restricted by your use of the word physical, and semblance involves a subjective interpretation, which changes with the rise and fall of the seconds." "By all means," Fair said, hesitantly, "describe it in your own words." "Well, we have 4 different regions, 2 of which fluoresce from the basic skeleton of the universe, and so subsede the others. The first of these is compressed and istheated, but is notable for its wide pools of mottle, which we use sometimes for deranging stations. We've transplanted club mosses from Earth's Devonian, and a few ice fires from Perdition. They climb among the rods which we call devil hair." He went on for several minutes, but the meaning almost entirely escaped Fair, and it seemed as if the question by which he had hoped to break the ice might run away with the entire interview. He introduced another idea. "Can we freely manipulate the physical extensions of Earth?" The sprite seemed amused. "You refer, so I assume, to the various aspects of space, time, mass, energy, life, thought, and recollection." "Exactly." The sprite raised its green corn-silk eyebrows. "I might as sensibly ask, can you break an egg by striking it with a club? The response is on a similar level of seriousness." Fair had expected a certain amount of condescension and impatience, and was not abashed. "How may I learn these techniques?" "In the usual manner, through diligent study." "Ah, indeed. But where could I study? Who would teach me?" The sprite made an easy gesture, and whorls of green smoke trailed from his fingers to spin through the air. "I could arrange the matter, but since I bear you no particular animosity, I'll do nothing of the sort. And now I must be gone." "Where do you go?" Fair asked in wonder and longing. "May I go with you?" The sprite, swirling a drape of bright green dust over its shoulders, shook his head. "You would be less than comfortable." "Other men have explored the worlds of magic." "True. Your Uncle Gerald McIntyre, for instance." "My Uncle Gerald learned green magic?" "To the limit of his capabilities. He found no pleasure in his learning. You would do well to profit by his experience and modify your ambitions." The sprite turned and walked away. Fair watched it depart. The sprite receded in space and dimension, but never reached the wall of Fair's room. At a distance which might have been 50 yards, the sprite glanced back, as if to make sure that Fair was not following, then stepped off at another angle and disappeared. Fair's first impulse was to take heed and limit his explorations. He was an adept in white magic and had mastered the black art. Occasionally, he evoked a demon to liven a social gathering which otherwise threatened to become dull. But he had by no means illuminated every mystery of purple magic, which is the realm of incarnate symbols. Howard Fair might have turned away from the green cycle except for three factors. First was his physical appearance. He stood rather under medium height, with a swarthy face, sparse black hair, a gnarled nose, a small, heavy mouth. He felt no great sensitivity about his appearance, but realized that it might be improved. In his mind's eye, he pictured the personified ideal of himself. He was taller by 6 inches, his nose thin and keen, his skin cleared of its muddy undertone. A striking figure, but still recognizable as Howard Fair. He wanted the love of women, but he wanted it without the interposition of his craft. Many times he had brought beautiful girls to his bed, lips wet and eyes shining, but purple magic had seduced them rather than Howard Fair, and he took limited satisfaction in such conquests. Here was the first factor which drew Howard Fair back to the green lore. The second was his yearning for extended, perhaps eternal, life. The third was simple thirst for knowledge. The fact of Gerald McIntyre's death, or dissolution, or disappearance, whatever had happened to him, was naturally a matter of concern. If he had won to a goal so precious, why had he died so quickly? Was the infinite reward so miraculous, so exquisite, that the mind failed under its possession? If such were the case, the reward was hardly a reward. Fair could not restrain himself, and by degrees returned to a study of green magic. Rather than again invoke the sprite whose air of indulgent contempt he had found exasperating, he decided to seek knowledge by an indirect method, employing the most advanced concepts of technical and Kabbalistic science. He obtained a portable television transmitter which he loaded into his panel truck along with the receiver. On a Monday night in early May, he drove to an abandoned graveyard far out in the wooded hills, and there, by the light of a waning moon, he buried the television camera in graveyard clay until only the lens protruded from the soil. With a sharp alder twig, he scratched on the ground a monstrous outline. The television lens served for one eye, a beer bottle pushed neck first into the soil, the other. During the middle hours, while the moon died behind wisps of pale cloud, he carved a word on the dark forehead, then recited the activating incantation. The ground rumbled and moaned. The golem heaved up to blot out the stars. The glass eyes stared down at Fair, secure in his pentagon. "Speak!" called out Fair. "Antarestis, Achmai Adonai, Bidemgir, Elohim, Pa Rahuli, Antarestis, Havoi, speak!" "Return me to earth. Return my clay to the quiet clay from whence you roused me. First, you must serve." The golem stumbled forward to crush Fair, but was halted by the pang of protective magic. "Serve you I will, if serve you I must." Fair stepped boldly forth from the pentagon, strung 40 yards of green ribbon down the road in the shape of a narrow V. "Go forth into the realm of green magic," he told the monster. "The ribbons reach 40 miles. Walk to the end, turn about, return, and then fall back. Return to the earth from which you rose." The golem turned, shuffled into the V of green ribbon, shaking off clods of mold, jarring the ground with its ponderous tread. Fair watched the squat shape dwindle, recede, yet never reached the angle of the magic V. He returned to his panel truck, tuned the television receiver to the golem's eye, and surveyed the fantastic vistas of the green realm. 2 elementals of the green realm met on a spun silver landscape. They were Jadian and Misthamar, and they fell to discussing the earthen monster which had stalked 40 miles through the region known as Sil, which then, turning in its tracks, had retraced its steps, gradually increasing its pace until at the end it moved in a shambling rush, leaving a trail of clods on the fragile moth-wing mosaics. Events, 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 Misthamar fretted. They crowd the chute of time till the bounds bulge. Or then again, the course is as lean and spare as a stretched tendon. But in regard to this incursion, he paused for a period of reflection, and silver clouds moved over his head and under his feet. Jadian remarked, "You are aware that I conversed with Howard Fair? He is so obsessed to escape the squalor of his world that he acts with recklessness." "The man Gerald McIntyre was his uncle," mused Misthamar. "McIntyre besought, we yielded, as perhaps now we must yield to Howard Fair." Jadian uneasily opened his hand, shook off a spray of emerald fire. "Events press, both in and out. I find myself unable to act in this regard. I likewise do not care to be the agent of tragedy." A meaning came fluttering up from below. "A disturbance among the spiral towers. A caterpillar of glass and metal has come clanking. It has thrust electric eyes into the Portinone and broken open the egg of innocence. Howard Fair is the fault." Jadian and Misthamar consulted each other with wry disinclination. "Very well, both of us will go. Such a duty needs 2 souls in support." They impinged upon earth and found Howard Fair in a wall booth at a cocktail bar. He looked up at the 2 strangers, and one of them asked, "May we join you?" Fair examined the 2 men. Both wore conservative suits and carried cashmere topcoats over their arms. Fair noticed that the left thumbnail of each man glistened green. Fair rose politely to his feet. "Will you sit down?" The green sprites hung up their overcoats and slid into the booth. Fair looked from one to the other. He addressed Jadian. "Aren't you he whom I interviewed several weeks ago?" Jadian assented. "You have not accepted my advice." Fair shrugged. "You asked me to remain ignorant, to accept my stupidity and ineptitude." "And why should you not?" asked Jadian gently. "You are a primitive in a primitive realm. Nevertheless, not one man in 1,000 can match your achievements." Fair agreed, smiling faintly. "But knowledge creates a craving for further knowledge. Where is the harm in knowledge?" Misthamar, the more mercurial of the sprites, spoke angrily. "Where is the harm? Consider your earthen monster. It befouled 40 miles of delicacy, the record of 10 million years. Consider your caterpillar. It trampled our pillars of carved milk, our dreaming towers, damaged the nerve skeins which extrude and waft us our meanings." "I'm dreadfully sorry," said Fair. "I meant no destruction." The sprites nodded. "But your apology conveys no guarantee of restraint." Fair toyed with his glass. A waiter approached the table, addressed the 2 sprites. "Something for you 2 gentlemen?" Jadian ordered a glass of charged water, as did Misthamar. Fair called for another highball. "What do you hope to gain from this activity?" inquired Misthamar. "Destructive forays teach you nothing." Fair agreed. "I have learned little, but I have seen miraculous sights. I am more than ever anxious to learn." The green sprites glumly watched the bubbles rising in their glasses. Jadian at last drew a deep sigh. "Perhaps we can obviate toil on your part and disturbance on ours. Explicitly, what gains or advantages do you hope to derive from green magic?" Fair, smiling, leaned back into the red imitation leather cushions. I want many things: extended life, mobility in time, comprehensive memory, augmented perception with vision across the whole spectrum. I want physical charm and magnetism, the semblance of youth, muscular endurance. Then there are qualities more or less speculative, such as— Jadian interrupted. These qualities and characteristics we will confer upon you. In return, you will undertake never again to disturb the green realm. You will evade centuries of toil. We will be spared the nuisance of your presence and the inevitable tragedy. Tragedy? Inquired Fair in wonder. Why tragedy? Jadian spoke in a deep, reverberating voice. You are a man of earth. Your goals are not our goals. Green magic makes you aware of our goals. Fair thoughtfully sipped his highball. I can't see that this is a disadvantage. I am willing to submit to the discipline of instruction. Surely a knowledge of green magic will not change me into a different entity. No, and this is the basic tragedy. Miss Thamar spoke in exasperation. We are forbidden to harm lesser creatures, and so you are fortunate, for to dissolve you into air would end all the annoyance. Fair laughed. I apologize again for making such a nuisance of myself, but surely you understand how important this is to me. Jadian asked hopefully, Then you agree to our offer? Fair shook his head. How could I live, forever young, capable of extended learning, but limited to knowledge which I already see bounds to? I would be bored, restless, miserable. That well may be, said Jadian, but not so bored, restless, and miserable as if you were learned in green magic. Fair drew himself erect. I must learn green magic. It is an opportunity which only a person both torpid and stupid could refuse. Jadian sighed. In your place I would make the same response. The sprites rose to their feet. Come then, we will teach you. Don't say we didn't warn you, said Miss Thamar. Time passed. Sunset waned and twilight darkened. A man walked up the stairs, entered Howard Fair's apartment. He was tall, unobtrusively muscular. His face was sensitive, keen, humorous. His left thumbnail glistened green. Time is a function of vital processes. The people of Earth had perceived the motion of their clocks. On this understanding, 2 hours had elapsed since Howard Fair had followed the green sprites from the bar. Howard Fair had perceived other criteria. For him, the interval had been 700 years, during which he had lived in the green realm, learning to the utmost capacity of his brain. He had occupied 2 years training his senses to the new conditions. Gradually he learned to walk in the 6 basic 3-dimensional directions and accustomed himself to the 4th-dimensional shortcuts. By easy stages, the blinds over his eyes were removed, so that the dazzling, overhuman intricacy of the landscape never completely confounded him. Another year was spent training him to the use of a code language, an intermediate step between the vocalizations of Earth and the meaning patterns of the green realm, where 100 symbol flakes, each a flitting spot of delicate iridescence, might be displayed in a single swirl of import. During this time, Howard Fair's eyes and brain were altered to allow him the use of the many new colors, without which the meaning flakes could not be recognized. These were preliminary steps. For 40 years he studied the flakes, of which there were almost 1,000,000. Another 40 years was given to elementary permutations and shifts, and another 40 to parallels, attenuation, diminishments, and extensions. and during this time he was introduced to flake patterns and certain of the more obvious displays. Now he was able to study without recourse to the code language, and his progress became more marked. Another 20 years found him able to recognize more complicated meanings, and he was introduced to a more varied program. He floated over the field of moth-wing mosaics, which still showed the footprints of the golem. He sweated in embarrassment, the extent of his wicked willfulness now clear to him. So passed the years. Howard Fair learned as much green magic as his brain could encompass. He explored much of the green realm, finding so much beauty that he feared his brain might burst. He tasted, he heard, he felt, he sensed, and each one of his senses was 100 times more discriminating than before. Nourishment came in 1,000 different forms, from pink eggs which burst into a hot, sweet gas, suffusing his entire body, from passing through a rain of stinging metal crystals, from simple contemplation of the proper symbol. Homesickness for Earth waxed and waned. Sometimes it was insupportable, and he was ready to forsake all he had learned and abandon his hopes for the future. At other times, the magnificence of the green realm permeated him, and the thought of departure seemed like the threat of death itself. By stages so gradual he never realized them, he learned green magic. But the new faculty gave him no pride. Between his crude ineptitudes and the poctic elegance of the sprites remained a tremendous gap, and he felt his innate inferiority much more keenly than he had ever had in his old state. Worse, his most earnest efforts failed to improve his technique, and sometimes, observing the singing joy of an improvised manifestation by one of the sprites, and contrasting it to his own labored constructions, he felt futility and shame. The longer he remained in the green realm, the stronger grew the sense of his own maladroitness, and he began to long for the easy environment of Earth, where each of his acts would not shout aloud of vulgarity and crassness. At times he would watch the sprites, in the gossamer forms natural to them, at play among the pearl petals, or twining like quick flashes of music through the forest of pink spirals. The contrast between their verve and his brutish fumbling could not be borne, and he would turn away. His self-respect dwindled with each passing hour, and instead of pride in his learning, he felt a sullen ache for what he was not and could never become. The first few 100 years he worked with the enthusiasm of ignorance. For the next few he was buoyed by hope. During the last part of his time, only dogged obstinacy kept him plodding through what now he knew for infantile exercises. In one terrible, bittersweet spasm, he gave up. He found Jadian weaving tinkling fragments of various magics into a warp of shining long splines. With grave courtesy, Jadian gave Fair his attention, and Fair laboriously set forth his meaning. Jadian returned a message. "I recognize your discomfort and extend my sympathy. It is best that you now return to your native home." He put aside his weaving and conveyed Fair down through the requisite vortices. Along the way they passed Misthamar. No flicker of meaning was expressed or exchanged, but Howard Fair thought to feel a tinge of faintly malicious amusement. Howard Fair sat in his apartment, his perceptions, augmented and sharpened by his sojourn in the green realm, took note of the surroundings. Only 2 hours before, by the clocks of Earth, he had found them both restful and stimulating. Now they were neither. His books, superstition, spuriousness, earnest nonsense. His private journals and workbooks, a pathetic scrawl of infantilisms. Gravity tugged at his feet, held him rigid. The shoddy construction of the house, which heretofore he had never noticed, oppressed him. Everywhere he looked he saw slipshod disorder, primitive filth. The thought of the food he must now eat revolted him. He went out on his little balcony, which overlooked the street. The air was impregnated with organic smells. Across the street he could look into windows where his fellow humans lived in stupid squalor. Fair smiled sadly. He had tried to prepare himself for these reactions, but now was surprised by their intensity. He returned into his apartment. He must accustom himself to the old environment. And after all, there were compensations. The most desirable commodities of the world were now his to enjoy. Howard Fair plunged into the enjoyment of these pleasures. He forced himself to drink quantities of expensive winks, brandies, liqueurs, even though they offended his palate. Hunger overcame his nausea. He forced himself to the consumption of what he thought of as fried animal tissue, the hypertrophied sexual organs of plants. He experimented with erotic sensations, but found that beautiful women no longer seemed different from the plain ones, and that he could barely steel himself to the untidy contacts. He bought libraries of erudite books, glanced through them with contempt. He tried to amuse himself with his old magics. They seemed ridiculous. He forced himself to enjoy these pleasures for a month. Then he fled the city and established a crystal bubble on a crag in the Andes. To nourish himself, he contrived a thick liquid, which, while by no means as exhilarating as the substances of the green realm, was innocent of organic contamination. After a certain degree of improvisation and makeshift, he arranged his life to its minimum discomfort. The view was one of austere grandeur. Not even the condors came to disturb him. He sat back to ponder the chain of events which had started with his discovery of Gerald McIntyre's workbook. He frowned. Gerald McIntyre? He jumped to his feet, looked far off over the crags. He found Gerald McIntyre at a wayside service station in the heart of the South Dakota prairie. McIntyre was sitting in an old wooden chair, tilted back against the peeling yellow paint of the service station, a straw hat shading his eyes from the sun. He was a magnetically handsome man, blond of hair, brown of skin, with blue eyes whose gaze stung like the touch of icicle. His left thumbnail glistened green. Fair greeted him casually. The two men surveyed each other with wry curiosity. "I see you have adapted yourself," said Howard Fair. McIntyre shrugged. "As well as possible. I try to maintain a balance between solitude and the pressure of humanity." He looked into the bright blue sky where crows flapped and called. "For many years I lived in isolation. I began to detest the sound of my own breathing." Along the highway came a glittering automobile, rococo as a hybrid goldfish. With the perceptions now available to them, Fair and McIntyre could see the driver to be red-faced and truculent, his companion a peevish woman in expensive clothes. "There are other advantages to residence here," said McIntyre. "For instance, I'm able to enrich the lives of passers-by with trifles of novel adventure." He made a small gesture. 24 crows swooped down and flew beside the automobile. They settled on the fenders, strutted back and forth along the hood, fouled the windshield. The automobile squealed to a halt. The driver jumped out, put the birds to flight. He threw an ineffectual rock, waved his arms in outrage, returned to his car, proceeded. "A paltry affair," said McIntyre with a sigh. "The truth of the matter is that I am bored." He pursed his mouth and blew forth 3 bright puffs of smoke, first red, then yellow, then blazing blue. "I have arrived at the estate of foolishness, as you can see." Fair surveyed his great-uncle with a trace of uneasiness. McIntyre laughed. "No more pranks. I predict, however, that you will presently share my malaise." "I share it already," said Fair. Sometimes I wish I could abandon all my magic and return to my former innocence. I have toyed with the idea, McIntyre replied thoughtfully. In fact, I have made all the necessary arrangements. It is really a simple matter. He led Fair to a small room behind the station. Although the door was open, the interior showed a thick darkness. McIntyre, standing well back, surveyed the darkness with a quizzical curl to his lip. You need only enter. All your magic, all your recollections of the green realm will depart. You will be no wiser than the next man you meet, and with your knowledge will go your boredom, your melancholy, your dissatisfaction. Fair contemplated the dark doorway. A single step would resolve his discomfort. He glanced at McIntyre. The two surveyed each other with sardonic amusement. They returned to the front of the building. Sometimes I stand by the door and look into the darkness, said McIntyre. Then I'm reminded how dearly I cherish my boredom and what a precious commodity is so much misery. Fair made himself ready for departure. I thank you for this new wisdom, which 100 more years in the green realm would not have taught me. And now, for a time at least, I go back to my crag in the Andes. McIntyre tilted his chair against the wall of the service station. And I, for a time at least, will wait for the next passer-by. Goodbye, then, Uncle Gerald. Goodbye, Howard. You've been listening to pre-1990s speculative fiction readings with a highlight on science fiction by Darrell T. Smith II. Please consider clicking the donation link in the description box. Thank you so much for your time and your imagination.